One of the most exciting and also challenging aspects of doing this course has been figuring out how to fit a very large amount of information into very short lectures. I always try to include enough information to give you a good sense of the range of any particular type or aspect of mystery and suspense fiction. But I'm always aware of how much I have to leave out. Nowhere is this more true than in this lecture, which will look at adaptations of written mystery and suspense fiction narratives in a variety of other media. Even though addressing such a wide variety and huge amount of material in a single lecture is a daunting prospect, it has to be done. Why? Because no study of mystery and suspense fiction would be complete without talking about the influence of the genre in popular culture more generally. Moreover, such adaptations and variations both reflect and contribute to the success of the genre. Obviously, these adaptations take a huge variety of forms, from versions of foundational characters, such as Sherlock Holmes, Hercule Poirot, and Miss Marple, to the long afterlife of Edgar Allan Poe, to film noir, to contemporary television crime shows, and much more. We'll see that both variations and continuities in these adaptations give us insight into which elements of mystery and suspense fiction are considered sacrosanct, and which are considered expendable or changeable. This gives us a good sense of what's considered essential to the genre's success. And finally, adaptations also give fans of mystery and suspense fiction an opportunity to give back to the genre they love by both reproducing and changing the aspects of the genre that excite them most. Let's begin by looking at two ways of thinking about adaptations that influence how people react to adaptations of mystery and suspense fiction in particular. On the one hand, there's a school of thought that stresses fidelity. This point of view judges adaptations according to how faithful or unfaithful they are in relation to the source material. Presumably, the ultimate goal of the faithful adaptation is to translate the original into another medium so successfully that the audience is hardly aware of any differences. A different school of thought argues that adaptations have no responsibility to be faithful to their source material at all. Instead, adaptations should be free to be creative reappropriations of their sources, choosing selectively what to keep and what to discard. Everyone feels differently about the debate that revolves around faithfulness versus creative adaptation. And we may even move from one side of the debate to the other, depending on who or what is being adapted. However, there's no denying the fact that we can feel very strongly about this issue, and that there can be a lot at stake when one of our favorite characters or books gets adapted into another medium. Let me demonstrate what I mean by looking at three different versions of one of the most popular characters in the history of mystery and suspense fiction: Sherlock Holmes. Beginning in 1939 with The Hound of the Baskervilles and ending with Dressed to Kill in 1946, 14 film adaptations of Sherlock Holmes were released that starred Basil Rathbone as Holmes and Nigel Bruce as Dr. Watson. The first two films were set in the Victorian era, but later films in the series sometimes updated the characters, so that Holmes and Watson investigate the Nazis, for instance, in the 1943 film Sherlock Holmes in Washington. Given this type of historical anomaly, one might expect this film series to be criticized for being unfaithful. But in fact, it's generally regarded with great fondness and a considerable degree of nostalgia as being one of the most faithful adaptations of Sherlock Holmes ever committed to film. Why is this? The secret, I think, is the casting. Rathbone and Bruce were regarded as so perfectly exemplifying the characters of Holmes and Watson that the vast majority of viewers tolerated them being placed in different circumstances. This indicates that the characters in mystery and suspense fiction are regarded as being the essential part of any adaptation. The circumstances surrounding the characters are, by comparison, malleable. A good test of this proposition is to look at a very different adaptation of Holmes, a television series featuring Benedict Cumberbatch as Holmes and Martin Freeman as Watson, that debuted in 2010 under the title Sherlock. In this case, the differences between the original and the adaptation couldn't be more pronounced. Not only is Sherlock set in the 21st century, but also most of the episodes, although they take their inspiration from the original Holmes stories, feel free to change and eliminate details as they see fit. The first episode of the series, A Study in Pink, is loosely based on Doyle's 1887 novel, A Study in Scarlet. But as the series creator Stephen Moffat commented, there are many elements of the story and the broad shape of it, but we mess around with it a lot. For example, both versions of the story contain the same clue, the word "rach," written at the scene of the crime. In Doyle's novel, Holmes scoffs at the idea that the victim was trying to write Rachel, and instead points out that Rach is the German word for revenge. In the television episode, on the other hand, Holmes dismisses the revenge explanation and instead suggests that the victim was trying to write Rachel. Although I was initially skeptical when I heard about this updated version of Holmes, when I sat down and watched it, I found that I, like millions of other viewers, absolutely loved it, even though it wasn't faithful to the original. How did the makers of the show get away with it? Once again, I think casting is a big part of the answer. Both Cumberbatch and Freeman are brilliant in their respective roles, not so much because they resemble Doyle's original characters, but more because they resemble what Doyle's characters might have become in the 21st century. In a similar vein, some of the other changes the series makes to the original make perfect sense, such as the extensive use that Holmes makes of the internet, and the way in which Watson writes about the cases they investigate in the form of a blog. In many cases, the characters behave and do the same things they did in the original version, but now realistically updated to conform to a contemporary setting. More than either of these factors, however, I think the success of Sherlock ultimately comes down to the spirit in which these changes are made. By this I mean that the series is infused with a tremendous sense of affection for the original characters, an affection that dictates the changes that are made and how they are made. The originals are never mocked for being old-fashioned or out of place. Instead, they're treated with respect as a source of inspiration, while at the same time being updated to reflect contemporary circumstances. But not all updates are created equal. In 2009, British director Guy Ritchie released the film Sherlock Holmes, starring Robert Downey Jr. as Holmes and Jude Law as Watson. Although the film has a period Victorian setting that gives it a surface resemblance to the original, in my view, it is by far the least faithful version of Holmes of the three we're considering, and that's why I absolutely hated it. Okay, I'll be honest. I also hated it because I hate Robert Downey Jr. Don't ask me why, I just do. In fact, whenever I discuss Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes in class, I write Robert Downey Jr. on the board and then I cross it out as a reminder to my students never to mention that name in the same breath as Sherlock Holmes. But the biggest problem with Ritchie's version of Holmes is that he turns him into an action hero. Granted, as we've seen in other lectures in this series, there was always a flavor of the adventure tale in Conan Doyle's work, which is one of the reasons why the word adventure appears in the titles of so many Holmes stories. But it was only a flavor. and in Ritchie's movie it becomes the substance, with ratiocination, analysis, and indeed any form of higher order thinking apparently thrown out of the window. Let me finish this rant by quoting one reviewer of the film, who sums up my feelings perfectly. "The makers of this film are mainly interested in action. That, they believe, is all that gets young audiences into cinemas today. They may be right, but they have ridden roughshod over one of literature's greatest creations in the process." As I said earlier, people get very passionate about the subject of adaptations of mystery and suspense fiction, and obviously I'm no exception to that rule. Let's try and cool things down for the remainder of this lecture by moving on to examine some other examples of the influence of the genre in popular culture. I want to begin with comics because it gives us an opportunity to remind ourselves that the relationship between this medium and mystery and suspense fiction goes back a long way. For example, in October 1931, the Detroit Mirror introduced a new comic book character by the name of Dick Tracy. The invention of Chester Gould, who would go on to write and draw Dick Tracy's adventures for an astonishing 46 years, the character underwent a lot of changes during that period. Dick Tracy's origins, however, are clearly indebted to the figure of the hard-boiled private eye as he appeared in Black Mask. And we can see that he also responds to the crime wave associated with Prohibition and the rise of the gangster by the fact that he frequently battles mob bosses. In an attempt to compete with and capitalize upon the success of Dick Tracy, in 1934, a company named King Features persuaded the master of the private eye story, Dashiell Hammett, to collaborate with artist Alex Raymond, who was responsible for the Flash Gordon comics, to produce a comic strip. The result was called Secret Agent X9, and unfortunately, it was a bit of a mess, precisely because the company and Hammett disagreed about which features of the private eye archetype to adapt and which to leave out. Whereas Hammett wanted the hero to be a private eye in the Sam Spade mode, King Features wanted a secret government agent. As you can imagine, neither side got what they wanted, and so Hammett left the project as soon as his contract expired. Mickey Spillane had a somewhat happier relationship with the comic book medium. In 1940, long before he dreamed up hard-boiled private eye Mike Hammer, Spillane worked for a comic book company in New York City called Funnies Inc. as a writer and assistant editor. Whereas it took the other writers a week to produce a Captain Marvel story, Spillane could reportedly turn one out in a day. In fact, he originally conceived of the story that would become his first novel, I, the Jury, as a comic book, featuring a character named Mike Danger. But he was unable to sell the idea because of a slump in the comic book market at the time. Despite the fact that Spillane eventually found lasting fame by writing novels rather than comic books, according to critic J. Kenneth Vandover, Spillane's time in the world of comics had a permanent impact on his writing. His novels transpose into literary form several aspects of the art of the comic book. Spillane's characters are designed for immediate recognition. Their outlines are simple, their colors are primary. His men are muscular, his women voluptuous. His landscapes, usually cityscapes, are generalized and are often rendered with ominous angles and dark shadows. Spillane's plots are far more complicated than those employed by the comics, but they progress in much the same manner. Since the hard-boiled era, of course, the comics medium has continued to grow and evolve by leaps and bounds. And today, one can find hundreds of comics and graphic novels that draw on mystery and suspense fiction themes. Some of these are adaptations of actual crime fiction texts, such as a series of graphic novels written and illustrated by Darwin Cook, that adapt the novels featuring a career criminal named Parker that were written by Richard Stark, a pseudonym for Donald E. Westlake, beginning in the 1960s. Others, such as the brilliant series Criminal, written by Ed Brubaker and illustrated by Sean Phillips, is clearly inspired by the defining elements of hard-boiled crime fiction, but also looks to update those conventions. The genre's been booming for so long that today you can find crime-themed comic books and graphic novels to suit every conceivable taste, including, arguably, those with no taste at all. I know that we've already talked about film adaptations a little bit in this lecture, but I want to return to the subject of film briefly because no lecture on adaptations of mystery and suspense fiction would be complete without saying at least a few words about film noir. I must confess that part of me is hesitant to raise this subject because I once, literally, had to separate two people who disagreed so vehemently about whether or not Orson Welles' 1958 film Touch of Evil was a film noir or not, that they came to blows. So, at the risk of starting a fight, let me ask, what is film noir? I think we can all agree that many examples of film noir adapt mystery fiction texts. But beyond that, things get confusing quickly. Why is this? Partly because film noir has always been a fairly loose and baggy category. As far back as 1955, in their book, A Panorama of American Film Noir, the original and therefore seminal extended treatment of the subject, Raymond Board and Etienne Chaumeton say that we'd be oversimplifying things in calling film noir oniric, strange, erotic, ambivalent, and cruel. In other words, film noir is even more complicated than that definition suggests. Subsequent critics would go on to define noir even more broadly, some calling it a genre, others a style, or a mood, a series, a cycle, a period, or any combination of the above. As one study puts it with a fine sense of understatement, there is no consensus on the matter. In recent years, as adaptations of noir texts have continued to multiply, the situation has become even more complicated, thanks to the development of what film scholar James Naramore, in a fine book called More Than Night, Film Noir in Its Contexts, calls the noir mediascape, which he describes as follows: a loosely related collection of perversely mysterious motifs or scenarios that circulate through all the information technologies. Given all this confusion about noir in general and film noir in particular, it's tempting to make things simpler by constructing a canon of noir adaptation, accompanied by a strict list of dates and criteria that will enable us to say, this one is in and this one is out. I want to resist this temptation, not least because it tends to lead to fights over Orson Welles, like the one I mentioned earlier. But I do want to share with you a very thought-provoking observation crime novelist George Pelecanos made when he was asked whether he thought contemporary noir was in danger of becoming a parody. Here's what he said. First of all, most producers don't even understand what noir is. Sure, they know the signs, Venetian blind shadows, cigarette smoke, etc. But they don't understand the core psychological aspects, the undercurrents of claustrophobia and anxiety which drive noir. Earlier, we saw that sometimes it's characters that define an adaptation, while on other occasions, it's setting. What I take from Pelecanos' comments is that with noir, adaptations are defined by a mood more than anything. If you're in the presence of a narrative that has a downbeat, paranoid, and hopeless view of the world, if you're in the presence of a narrative that is pessimistic about everything, but particularly about whether people can ever understand or be happy with each other, then you're in the presence of a noir narrative. That atmosphere, that mood, can encompass any number of characters and settings, And perhaps we should be celebrating that diversity rather than arguing about when film noir began and when it ended. The fact that George Pelecanos, apart from being a very fine crime novelist, also worked as a writer on David Simon's award-winning TV drama, The Wire, allows me to now transition into a brief discussion of television adaptations. In earlier lectures, I've mentioned Dragnet, which, by the way, was itself an adaptation of an earlier radio show with the same name. Ever since it burst onto American television screens in December 1951, crime-related programming has been a staple feature of the televisual medium. If we survey the contemporary mediascape of crime shows on TV, two things stand out: their variety and their hybridity. In that basic but nonetheless important sense, crime-related TV mirrors the diversity and complexity of mystery and suspense fiction as a whole. Consider the following examples. Law & Order, which debuted in 1990 and eventually ran for 20 seasons, combines the courtroom drama with the police procedural. CSI, which began in 2000 and ran for 15 seasons, blends the forensic thriller with the police procedural. While Criminal Minds, which premiered in 2005 and is still going strong, brings together the psychological thriller with the police procedural. Apart from confirming the triumph of varieties of the police procedural in contemporary crime television, what these shows also demonstrate is the importance of hybridity. By bringing together and blending aspects of mystery and suspense narratives that may previously have been discrete, these shows and their numerous spin-off series have hit on a winning formula. But hybridity is only part of the story. If we also consider the popularity and influence of shows like The Sopranos, Dexter, Boardwalk Empire, and The Wire, it's clear to see that there's also great demand for narratives with criminal rather than law enforcement protagonists. Some have argued that the boom in law enforcement-related TV shows is a product of the public's fear of crime. But if that's so, then that fear is also clearly accompanied by an ongoing fascination with criminality. The variety of crime-related television programming is not only a good business decision, it's also a reflection of the incredible diversity of the genre that this programming draws upon. Long before television even existed, mystery and suspense fiction was already hard at work, generating an incredible number of subgenres and niche audiences for later media to adapt and update for their own ends. In the final part of this lecture, I want to address a very particular kind of adaptation that flies under most people's radars, namely the contributions of mystery and suspense fiction fans themselves to adapting the narratives that they love. Fans of mystery and suspense fiction have always had a strongly participatory relationship with the genre. A great early example of this phenomenon occurred when Sir Arthur Conan Doyle attempted to kill off his famous creation, Sherlock Holmes, in The Final Problem in 1893. Doyle couldn't have anticipated the public reaction to Holmes's death. He received thousands of letters begging him to bring Holmes back. Many "Let's Keep Holmes Alive" clubs were founded in American cities, and Doyle was offered incredible sums of money to write more Holmes stories, such as an offer of $5,000 from America and a fee of £100 for every 1,000 words from the British magazine The Strand. Doyle eventually succumbed to the pressure, and The Hound of the Baskervilles began to appear in serialized form in 1901. Even then, Doyle gave himself an out, in that this new Holmes novel was set at a time before The Final Problem, as Watson carefully explains in Hound. And so, Technically speaking, this new novel was not the return of Holmes. The public, however, obviously began to suspect that Holmes was coming back to life, and when he did, in October 1903, in a story entitled The Adventure of the Empty House, the anticipation was so intense that huge lines formed outside the offices of the Strand magazine. Strangely enough, Doyle received his knighthood in 1902, becoming Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And people couldn't decide whether the award was for his propaganda work for the Boer War in South Africa or for bringing Holmes back to life. Today, there are thousands of Sherlock Holmes societies all over the world where fans gather to read and discuss their favorite stories. In fact, I am a proud, if somewhat nerdy, member of the Buffalo branch, which is called an Irish Secret Society at Buffalo, after a reference to the city of Buffalo in the Holmes story, His Last Bow. By far the most significant type of fan participation in mystery and suspense fiction today, however, comes in the form of fan fiction. If you were to visit the website fanfiction.net, for example, you'd find literally thousands of stories about a wide range of genres, characters, and TV shows. Let me give you a few examples. Brown-Eyed Girl by LJC is based on Dashiell Hammett's The Maltese Falcon and reimagines the character of Effie Perrine. Lover of Anime 713's Bond Meets Elmo takes Ian Fleming's hero to Sesame Street, where, to quote the story description, it doesn't go well. Finally, Here Be Dragons by Spartanster 007 is a story based on Ellis Peters's Brother Cadfael. As I hope this small selection of titles indicates, fan fiction is not only various in terms of the range of texts and characters it reworks, but also in terms of its attitudes toward that material. Some of it is homage, some of it is parody, and some of it is, quite frankly, difficult or even impossible to classify. As you can imagine, the literary quality of this fan fiction varies too. But what all the stories have in common is that they come out of a deep engagement with mystery and suspense fiction. In this respect, in my view, they are the most heartfelt, if not always the most skilled, adaptations around. It's also worth noting that some fan fiction comes with a warning. Why? For what is rather ominously described as adult content. This is where we need to draw a distinction between fan fiction in general and slash fiction, which refers to a specific type of fan fiction that focuses on interpersonal, frequently sexual relationships between members of the same sex. As Eleanor Gray has commented in a column on the website Sherlockian.net, fan fiction is subversive in ways that only free media can be. Slash fiction is an excellent example of her point. Once again, Sherlock Holmes and John Watson tend to attract a lot of attention from writers of slash fiction. And although the results may not be to everyone's taste, especially those who insist on fidelity in their adaptations, you could hardly find a better example of many of the points I've been making in this lecture. Like the other adaptations we've discussed, slash fiction takes what it regards as the core features of its source material and then adapts those features to suit its purposes. In the process, some aspects of mystery and suspense fiction get left behind. Some get picked up and transmuted. But the genre as a whole continues to do what it's always done: evolve, innovate, and entertain.